The long road to parenthood. Sarah and Andy Justice had always dreamed of becoming parents. From the moment they said their vows, they envisioned a life filled with laughter, mess, and the kind of chaos only children could bring. But what they didn't expect was the long, emotionally taxing road they would have to walk to become parents. Sarah and Andy, both in their early 30s, had always felt that their relationship was a strong one built on mutual respect, love, and shared dreams. They were the kind of couple that everyone admired, and when they talked about having children, their eyes would light up with excitement. However, when they began trying for a family, they quickly learned that something so natural for many couples wasn't going to be easy for them. Their journey began innocently enough. Sarah stopped taking birth control, and they simply allowed nature to take its course. They weren't in a rush, thinking that it would happen when the time was right. But after a year went by and there were no signs of a baby on the way, they started to worry. 2 years passed, then 3. The months stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last. Sarah and Andy found themselves watching friends and family members celebrate pregnancies and baby showers while they quietly suffered in silence. People asked when they were going to start their family, and with every question, the pain in Sarah's heart deepened. She smiled through the questions, but inside a storm of emotions raged. She felt like a failure, like her body was betraying her. Andy, though he tried to remain strong for Sarah, began to feel the weight of the situation as well. They sought medical advice after a year of trying without success. The results were unsettling. Sarah was diagnosed with unexplained infertility. There was no clear reason why she couldn't conceive, just that her body wasn't responding the way it should. Andy was told that his sperm count was slightly lower than average, though not significantly enough to prevent conception on its own. The doctors explained that it was a combination of factors, but no one could offer any clear answers or solutions. The news was devastating. The couple had always dreamed of becoming parents, the old-fashioned way, but now it seemed as though they might never have that opportunity. Sarah, in particular, was torn. She felt that motherhood was a part of who she was, something that defined her, and not being able to conceive felt like a piece of her was missing. It didn't help that people around them, despite their best intentions, began to offer unsolicited advice. Have you tried just
relax, they would say, or you should just adopt to Sarah. These comments were both frustrating and heartbreaking. She longed for the day when she could tell her friends and family that she was pregnant, that she too would be holding a child of her own. But that day hadn't come, and the more she thought about it, the more she felt trapped by a sense of failure. The emotional toll was taking its toll on their marriage too. Once a couple with a light-hearted relationship, they now found themselves drifting apart. Conversations that used to be filled with laughter were now heavy and filled with unsaid words. Sarah started to shut down, unable to share her true feelings with Andy, fearing that he would be disappointed in her. Meanwhile, Andy struggled with the pain of seeing his wife in so much pain, and he began to wonder if he was somehow the problem. The connection they once had seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a distance that neither of them knew how to bridge. Finally, in a moment of clarity, Andy suggested they visit a fertility specialist. Sarah had resisted at first, reluctant to believe that this could be the path they needed to take. But in her heart, she knew they had reached a crossroads. They couldn't keep living in limbo. In 2014, Sarah and Andy packed up and traveled to St. Louis, Missouri, in hopes of finding the answers they so desperately needed. The fertility specialist they consulted seemed kind and thorough. He explained the various treatments available and talked to them about options like IUI, intrauterine insemination, and IVF, in vitro fertilization. But he was also candid about the challenges they faced. I wish I could tell you that there's a quick fix, but the reality is that these things take time, the doctor explained, and even then, there's no guarantee. The news wasn't what Sarah and Andy had hoped to hear, but they were determined not to give up. They tried IUI first, but after several cycles with no success, the doctor suggested they move forward with IVF. The couple was unsure at first. IVF felt so invasive, so emotionally intense, but they didn't see another option. However, the financial burden of IVF was overwhelming. They were quoted a staggering price for one round of IGF, $122,000 to $115,000 for just one cycle, with the possibility of needing multiple cycles. The justices were faced with the cold, hard truth. They simply couldn't afford that kind of treatment. They felt the weight of the financial strain and emotional exhaustion press down on them, making them question whether they were ever going to become parents. Despite the uncertainty, Andy and Sarah refused to give up. In an emotional conversation, they made the decision to try one last option: adoption. This wasn't a choice they had originally planned on, but after much reflection, they realized that becoming parents was what mattered most to them, however that happened. The adoption process wasn't easy either. It was complicated, drawn out, and often disheartening. They faced challenges in finding an agency that they felt truly comfortable with, one that could offer them the kind of support they would need along the way. They completed paperwork, went through psychological evaluations, and endured endless home studies. Every step seemed to take longer than they had anticipated, and with every delay, their hearts grew heavier. "Are we ever going to get there?" Sarah would often ask in moments of doubt, and Andy, ever the optimist, would take her hand and assure her, "We will. We have to believe that we will." Still, as the months passed, they began to feel discouraged. The dream of parenthood felt farther and farther away. The adoption interviews with birth mothers were nerve-wracking, full of anxiety and second-guessing. Would they be chosen? Would the birth mother feel comfortable with them? After each interview, they would go home and try to not read too much into the results, but each time they were turned away, a part of them cracked. But one day they received the call. The birth mother had chosen them. Their hearts soared with joy. Sarah couldn't believe it. She was going to be a mother. After everything they had been through, it was finally happening. The excitement of being chosen was tempered by a deep sense of responsibility and uncertainty. This wasn't just about adopting a child. It was about opening their hearts and their lives to a child who needed them, no matter the challenges that came with it. They were ready to take the leap, but they didn't know what the future would bring. Little did they know their journey was about to take a surprising and unexpected turn. A family reborn. The surprising news. The adoption agency had told Sarah and Andy that it would take time to finalize the paperwork and go through the legal steps, but in the whirlwind of emotions, they barely noticed the slow march of time. Their minds were consumed with thoughts of their new family, what it would be like to finally hold their child, to bring them home, and to shower them with the love and care they had waited so long to give. Every little detail, from decorating the nursery to picking out clothes, was something they had dreamed of during the long years of waiting. The call came just after they had returned from a weekend getaway, a trip to clear their minds and reconnect with one another. It was the kind of trip that had always brought them closer, and now it was as though fate had been preparing them for this next step. "Sarah, Andy, it's time," the voice on the other end of the phone said. It was the adoption agency worker, her voice warm but filled with excitement. "The birth mother has made her choice. She's decided that she wants you both to adopt her children." The words didn't fully register at first. Children, plural. The justices had been expecting one baby, perhaps a newborn, but the reality they were facing was far more extraordinary than they had ever imagined. The call continued. The birth mother had twins, two beautiful babies who were born prematurely. She was unable to care for them, and though she had planned on keeping them at first, her circumstances had changed. She wanted to give them a better life, one that she couldn't provide, and so she had made the difficult decision to place them up for adoption. But that wasn't all, as it turns out, the adoption worker said carefully. There's also a third child, another baby who's part of the same family. It's a little unusual, but the birth mother had a surprise during her ultrasound, and it turns out that she's been carrying triplets. The words took a moment to sink in. Triplets? 3 children. Sarah and Andy's minds reeled and their hearts raced. The idea of becoming parents had always felt like a far-off dream, and now they were faced with an entirely different reality. 3 babies instead of 1. "What do we do?" Andy asked, his voice filled with a mixture of shock and joy. "We've only prepared for 1. The adoption worker laughed softly. "I understand how this might feel overwhelming, but if you're open to it, this could be the perfect opportunity for your family to grow in ways you never expected. These children need love, and you've already proven you're ready for parenthood." There was a long pause on the other end of the line as Sarah and Andy processed the news. The idea of raising 3 children at once was daunting. They had never thought they would become parents of triplets, but their hearts, already full of love and desire to be parents, couldn't turn away from the possibility. "I'll talk to Andy," Sarah said, her voice full of emotion, "but I think we both know what we want."
"We want this. We've wanted this for so long." The adoption worker assured them that they had time to decide, that there was no pressure to make a rush decision. But in Sarah and Andy's hearts, there was no question that we're ready. They had been waiting for a family of their own for so long that the idea of adopting 3 children, no matter how overwhelming it seemed, felt like the gift they had been longing for. As soon as they hung up the phone, Sarah turned to Andy. His face mirrored her own shock and disbelief, but also of something else, something deeper. There was no hesitation in his eyes. "I think this is what we were meant to do," he said softly. They both knew that life had just thrown them an unexpected challenge, but for the first time in years, it felt like everything was falling into place. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. The justices were suddenly tasked with making room for 3 babies. They had to rethink everything. The nursery, which had been planned for a single baby, now had to accommodate 3 cribs, 3 wardrobes, and more supplies than they could have imagined. But they didn't care. The logistics were minor compared to the overwhelming joy of finally becoming parents. When they met the triplets for the first time, the moment felt surreal. The babies were tiny, born prematurely. They weighed only a few pounds each, and they had to be cared for in a special neonatal unit until they were strong enough to go home. But even in the incubators, wrapped in tiny blankets and hooked up to various medical devices, they were beautiful. Their tiny hands, their delicate features. It was as though Sarah and Andy were seeing miracles unfold before their eyes. There was a moment when Sarah gazed at the triplets, each one lying peacefully in their separate bassinets. A sense of deep gratitude washed over her. She had dreamed of being a mother for so long, and now here she was, not with 1 baby, but 3. Her heart was full and her eyes glistened with happy tears. Andy stood beside her, a smile stretching across his face. "This is our family," he whispered. They spent hours with the babies, watching them breathe in and out, taking in the sights and sounds of their new life as parents. It was overwhelming, but also exhilarating. In the blink of an eye, they had gone from longing for a child to being the proud parents of 3 precious babies. As the weeks passed, Sarah and Andy grew more and more in love with their new family. They took on the responsibilities of parenthood with grace and determination, even as the sleepless nights and constant feedings wore them down. But there were moments, small and quiet, when they would look at each other and remember the long journey that had brought them here.
And in those moments, they knew that every sacrifice, every disappointment, every obstacle they had faced had been worth it. But life had a way of surprising them, even now, just as they were beginning to feel like they were finding their rhythm as parents of triplets. Something unexpected happened. It was the day of a routine checkup that would change everything. At the clinic, the doctor had asked them to bring the babies in for their regular checkup. It was just a standard visit, nothing out of the ordinary. But when the doctor examined the triplets, his expression shifted. "Mr. and Mrs. Justice," the doctor said with a serious tone, "there's something we need to talk about." The Justices exchanged a look of concern. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with anxiety. The doctor hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I've been reviewing the baby's medical records, and there's something very unusual about their genetics. The tests show that while they were born from the same birth mother, they share a genetic anomaly that, well, it's quite rare. In fact, it's something I've only seen a few times in my career." Sarah and Andy sat up straighter, their hearts pounding. This was not the news they had expected. "The triplets are not just genetically linked to one another," the doctor continued, "but they share a connection to another child, a child who we believe may be related to you." The revelation was both stunning and bewildering. What could this mean? What were they about to discover about the 3 babies they had come to love so deeply? The hidden truth, unveiling the connection. The moment the doctor dropped his bombshell, the world seemed to slow down for Sarah and Andy. They sat in stunned silence, trying to grasp the implications of his words. There was a connection to another child, one they had never known about. It was as though the ground beneath them had shifted, and everything they thought they knew about their adoption had suddenly become uncertain. The doctor continued, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of concern. "We've reviewed the genetic data, and while it's still unclear how this happened, there's a possibility that these triplets may not be biologically related to their birth mother in the way we initially thought. There could be a mix-up, or perhaps there's another child involved in this story." "We haven't accounted for." Sarah felt her breath catch in her chest. "Are you saying that the babies aren't really ours?" Her voice trembled as the fear of losing her children, her 3 babies, began to sink in. The thought was unbearable. "No," the doctor replied quickly, trying to reassure her. "What I'm saying is that there's a genetic anomaly, something that ties the babies to another individual, someone who, by all accounts, should not be involved in this adoption process." Andy reached out to squeeze Sarah's hand, grounding her in the present moment. He turned to the doctor, his expression one of disbelief, but also determination. "Are you suggesting they have a sibling out there? A biological sibling?" The doctor nodded. "Possibly, yes. And we need to investigate this further to understand the full scope of the situation. We don't know the details yet, but there's a child, another one, who might be connected to these triplets, and it could be a matter of the adoption agency not having full access to all the information." The air fell thick with tension as Sarah and Andy processed the doctor's words. How could this be? Had there been some sort of mistake in the adoption process? Or was this a deeper, more complex situation that they hadn't anticipated? "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, as though afraid to break the fragile silence that had enveloped the room. "We need to gather more information," the doctor said, his tone serious. "I'm going to send these results to the adoption agency. They'll need to review the records, and they may have some answers. But it's critical that we get to the bottom of this for the sake of these babies and for your peace of mind." The next few days felt like a whirlwind. The justices were sent into a state of frantic uncertainty as they awaited answers. Their minds were consumed by the question of who these children truly were and what the genetic anomaly meant.
Had they been mistaken, or was there a deeper, more complex situation that they hadn't anticipated? "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, as though afraid to break the fragile silence that had enveloped the room. "We need to gather more information," the doctor said, his tone serious. "I'm going to send these results to the adoption agency. They'll need to review the records, and they may have some answers. But it's critical that we get to the bottom of this for the sake of these babies and for your peace of mind." The next few days felt like a whirlwind. The justices were sent into a state of frantic uncertainty as they awaited answers. Their minds were consumed by the question of who these children truly were and what the genetic anomaly meant. Had they been misled, or was there a deeper reason for the connection to this mysterious other child? In the meantime, the justices did everything they could to stay focused on their new family. The triplets, now a few weeks old, were thriving. Their tiny faces, their first smiles, and the moments of quiet bonding between Sarah, Andy, and the babies filled the justices' hearts with love. Despite the mounting tension, they tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for the triplets' sake and for their own. They had already overcome so much to bring the children into their lives.
Regardless of the questions that now loomed over them, but the uncertainty gee at them, it was a week later when they received the call from the adoption agency. The worker's voice was soft and empathetic as she delivered the news. "Mr. and Mrs. Justice, I'm afraid there has been some confusion regarding the adoption process," she began. "The triplets you adopted were indeed placed under your care with the information we had at the time. However, after further investigation, it appears that there was a mix-up in the adoption paperwork, and there may have been a significant error in the information we provided you." Sarah and Andy listened in stunned silence, each of them silently holding their breath as they awaited more details. The birth mother, as we now understand it, was under considerable stress during the time of the pregnancy, the worker continued. She had been involved with a previous partner, someone who has a very close connection to you both, though it's not something you may have known. The words were coming too quickly now, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place, but without the clarity to fully understand what they meant. Sarah and Andy exchanged a look, unsure how to process this revelation. "Close connection to us," Andy repeated, his voice shaky. "What do you mean?" "There was a mix-up in the adoption records, but after reviewing everything again, it appears that the triplets are biologically related to you, Mr. and Mrs. Justice." The silence that followed was deafening. The air seemed to crackle with tension as Sarah and Andy struggled to comprehend the weight of the words they had just heard. The babies, their babies, were biologically theirs. "Are you saying that these babies are ours by blood?" Sarah whispered, her heart racing. "Yes," the worker confirmed. "It appears the birth mother, in her distress, didn't realize that the father of the children was someone connected to you both." Sarah was frozen. Her mind was reeling, spinning in circles. Who could it possibly be? Could it be a long-lost relative or a distant family member? Andy sat up straighter. Who is this father? How is he connected to us? The adoption worker hesitated, a long pause before she spoke again. "It's your brother, Mr. Justice. The biological father of the triplets is your younger brother, Nathan." The revelation hit them like a bolt of lightning, leaving Sarah and Andy both speechless and reeling. Nathan, their younger brother. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had always known that Andy had a younger brother, but they hadn't been close for many years. Nathan had gone off to college, and the family had lost touch with him over time. The idea that Nathan was the father of their adopted triplets, children who they had fallen in love with, children they had longed for so deeply, was something beyond comprehension. Andy's hand trembled as he held the phone. "Are you sure about this? Is this really true?" "We've confirmed the results with genetic testing," the worker said gently. "Nathan has been in contact with the agency, and he has acknowledged his role in the situation. He was unaware of the adoption proceedings, and it appears there was an error in the records. He is the father of the triplets." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the enormity of what she was hearing. The man they had known as a distant, absent brother was now the biological father of the children they had grown to love as their own. "We need to meet with Nathan," Andy said, his voice shaky but determined. "We need to understand what happened." The journey to unravel this tangled web of secrets and surprises was just beginning, and Sarah and Andy realized that their lives and their understanding of family had just taken a turn into uncharted territory. The triplets were no longer just their adopted children. They were family in a way they hadn't even imagined. And now the question wasn't just about raising them. It was about learning who they really were and what role Nathan would play in their lives moving forward. The justices had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain: their journey as parents was about to get even more complicated and far more extraordinary than they ever could have imagined. The truth unraveled, confrontation, and choices. The following days were a blur for Sarah and Andy as they tried to piece together the shattering truth of the triplets' origins. Nathan, their estranged younger brother, was the biological father of the children they had lovingly adopted. The shock of it all was still fresh, and both Sarah and Andy felt like they were living in an alternate reality where nothing made sense anymore. Nathan's existence, which had seemed so distant for years, was now an undeniable part of their lives. The questions swirled in their minds endlessly. Why had he never been a part of their lives when he was growing up? Why had he disappeared without a trace, only to reappear in the most unexpected and life-altering way? How could they ever reconcile with the idea that the triplets, the very children they had hoped for, were actually tied to a family secret they hadn't even known existed? The conversation with the adoption worker had left them with more questions than answers. Nathan had acknowledged his paternity, but what exactly did that mean for their future as parents to the triplets? Would Nathan demand a role in their lives now that he knew his children had been adopted by his older brother and sister-in-law? And perhaps the most difficult question, what did they want from him? Determined to face the situation head-on, Andy reached out to Nathan. The message was simple but carried the weight of the moment. We need to talk. Nathan agreed to meet them at the coffee shop down the street from their house, the place where they had shared so many conversations over the years before the distance had crept between them. It was the evening of their meeting when Sarah and Andy arrived. The small cafe was nearly empty, the dim lighting giving the room a somber mood that matched the heaviness of the conversation they were about to have. They found a corner booth, and soon after, Nathan walked in. His face was familiar but different, older perhaps, harder, as if the years of silence between them had changed him in ways they couldn't even begin to understand. Nathan looked around the cafe and spotted them, giving a small, hesitant wave as he approached. He looked slightly uncomfortable, his posture. It had been years since they had all been in the same room, and the air was thick with the weight of unspoken words. "Hey, Sarah, Andy?" His voice was quieter than usual, as though he was trying to gauge their reactions before he said anything more. He sat down slowly, avoiding eye contact for a moment. "Thanks for agreeing to meet with us," Sarah began, her voice calm but filled with uncertainty. She didn't know what to say, how to ask him the hundreds of questions that filled her mind, but she had to try. She had to understand. Nathan nodded but didn't speak immediately, his hands fidgeting with the sleeve of his jacket. There was an awkward pause, and then Andy, who had been silently processing everything, finally spoke up. "I don't even know where to start, Nathan," he said, his voice strained. "How long have you known about the triplets, and why? Why didn't you tell us anything sooner?" Nathan seemed to shrink back, and his eyes flickered nervously toward the door, as if he was considering running out. But he didn't. He took a deep breath and finally spoke, his voice low and quiet. "It wasn't something I planned to keep from you both," Nathan began, his eyes finally meeting theirs, though there was a sadness in them that he couldn't hide. It's complicated."
"Complicated?" Sarah repeated. Her voice cracked as the frustration and confusion from the past few days bubbled up to the surface. "Nathan, we've been through hell trying to have children. We've been through IVF, fertility treatments, and years of emotional heartbreak. And all this time, you were involved with the birth mother?" Nathan's expression shifted, and for the first time since he had sat down, he seemed to be more present in the conversation. "It wasn't like that," he said softly. "I wasn't even sure I was the father until just recently. I had no idea that the babies were mine until the adoption agency contacted me. They found me after the records were reviewed, and everything started to make sense." Andy narrowed his eyes. "You didn't know then? How come no one reached out to you before? How come you've been completely absent from everything?" Nathan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "I didn't want to be involved. I wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. And to be honest, I was ashamed. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, and I didn't want to bring my mess into your lives. I thought it was better if I just stayed away." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly wrestling with his emotions. "I didn't want to be a burden to you, especially when I knew you had your own family issues to deal with." Sarah's heart softened at his words, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he wasn't telling them. "So, you just disappeared? You didn't care enough to at least check in to see if we were all right? You didn't even want to know that your own children were out there needing a family?" Nathan's eyes welled up with emotion, and Sarah could see the pain in his expression. "No, that's not it. I didn't want to be the reason for more drama in your lives. I felt like I was already a screw-up, and when I found out, when they told me the kids were mine, I wasn't sure I was the right person to raise them. I was a mess, and I didn't want to drag them into it." Andy leaned forward, his brow furrowing, and fought Nathan. "We're not blaming you, but this is more than just a mistake or some personal guilt. These are our kids now, the Triplets. They're our family. We've fallen in love with them, and we have to think about what happens next." Silence fell between them again, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Sarah, heart pounding, looked at Nathan. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to understand why he had stayed away for so long. But the reality of the situation was that their lives had become intertwined in a way they hadn't anticipated. Nathan, still holding back tears, finally spoke again. "I understand. I know I messed up, but I want to make it right. I don't want to be just some relative. I want to be a part of their lives. I know I'm not perfect, but I want to be there for them, for all of you." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion and possibility. Sarah and Andy exchanged a glance, each of them weighing the implications of what this would mean for their family. Would Nathan be a positive influence in their children's lives? Could they trust him after years of silence? It was a question they couldn't answer right away, but one thing was certain: their lives, their journey with the Triplets had just become far more complicated. The path ahead was unclear, but as parents, they would have to make the choices that would shape their children's futures, knowing that their family was no longer just the three of them. They had all come a long way. But the most difficult decisions were still ahead, unraveling the threads, confronting the past, and embracing the future. The weeks following Nathan's unexpected revelation were a whirlwind for Sarah and Andy. Their once simple and predictable lives had shifted into a tumult of questions, concerns, and decisions that they hadn't prepared for. The joy of their adoption, the love they had for the Triplets, was still there, but it was now accompanied by uneasy uncertainty. Could they accept Nathan back into their lives? Could they trust him, knowing his past and the way he had distanced himself for so long?
The first days after the meeting with Nathan were spent in silence. Sarah and Andy tried to process everything, but the weight of the truth felt almost too much to bear. The triplets were their children, and they had no intention of losing them. But how did Nathan's return fit into the puzzle of their family? One evening, as they sat together in their living room, Sarah finally broke the silence. "Andy, what do we do now?" she asked, her voice raw with emotion. "I love the triplets more than anything, but this whole situation with Nathan, I don't know how to make sense of it." Andy sat down his cup of coffee and turned to look at his wife. "I don't know either, but we can't ignore it. Nathan's part of this now, whether we like it or not. He's their biological father, and the truth is, he has every right to be a part of their lives. But we can't let him walk in and out of our lives on a whim. We need to have boundaries." Sarah nodded, her eyes full of worry. "I agree that I'm scared. What if he messes this up again? What if he hurts the kids?" Andy placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We can't protect them from everything, but we can make sure they're surrounded by love, and we can give Nathan the chance to prove that he's changed. If he doesn't, then we make the decision that's best for them. We're gonna have to do this alone." The conversation left Sarah feeling a little more at ease, but there was still a lingering uncertainty in her heart. The idea of Nathan being a part of their children's lives was a reality they couldn't avoid, but how much of a role he would play was still unclear. There was one thing Sarah knew for certain, though. She had to protect the triplets at all costs. They were her children, and nothing, not even Nathan, would take that away from her. The following weekend, Sarah and Andy invited Nathan over to their house. They had decided that the only way to move forward was to create a clear understanding between all of them. No more secrets, no more misunderstandings. Nathan seemed eager to meet with them again, as though he had something important to prove. He arrived at their doorstep early on a Saturday morning, carrying a small gift bag, his hands shaking slightly. Sarah and Andy greeted him politely, though both were still feeling the weight of their last conversation. They had agreed to be open-minded, but the sense of caution was palpable in the air. After some pleasantries and small talk, they all gathered in the living room. Sarah, not wanting to waste any more time with uncertainty, got straight to the point. "Nathan," she began, her voice steady but firm, "we want to make sure we're clear on what's happening here. The triplets are our children now. We love them, and they love us. You're their biological father, but we raised them. We've cared for them from the moment they came into our lives. We don't want to undermine that, but we also can't ignore the fact that you're their father, and we have to figure out how to move forward from here." Nathan nodded, his face solemn. "I understand. I'm not trying to come in and take over. I've made mistakes, and I don't expect you to just forgive me and welcome me with open arms."
"But I want to be involved in their lives, if you'll let me. I want to support you both, and I want to be there for them, unwilling to do whatever it takes." His words were genuine, but Sarah couldn't help but wonder if he truly understood the gravity of the responsibility he was asking for. It wasn't just about showing up now. It was about being consistent, being reliable, and most importantly, being a positive influence in the children's lives. She wasn't sure if Nathan could provide that, but she was willing to give him the chance to prove himself. "You have to show us that you're here for the right reasons," Andy said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We can't just trust you because you are their father. You have to prove that you can be a part of their lives in a healthy, stable way. If we feel like you're not ready for that, then we will make the decision that's best for our family." Nathan's eyes flashed with something, perhaps fear, perhaps determination, but he nodded without hesitation. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I know I'm not perfect, but I want to try. I don't want to be a stranger to my own kids." Over the next several months, Nathan began making efforts to be involved, though it was not without its challenges. Sarah and Andy set clear boundaries. Nathan could visit the children, but only under supervision. He could attend family gatherings, but he had to respect their decisions as parents. Slowly, he began to prove his commitment to being a responsible adult, though his past still loomed over them like a shadow. Sarah was cautious but hopeful. She watched Nathan closely, noticing the small changes in him. He seemed to genuinely care for the triplets, but there was always that lingering doubt. Could he maintain this newfound commitment? Could he truly be the father they needed him to be? In the meantime, the triplets continued to thrive under Sarah and Andy's loving care. They were growing into curious, bright, and happy children. Sarah was amazed at how resilient they were, how quickly they had adapted to their new life, and how deep their bond had become. There was no doubt in her mind that they were her children, and she was determined to protect them no matter what. But as Nathan's visits became more frequent, Sarah and Andy noticed something strange. The children seemed to respond to him in ways they hadn't before. There was a connection, a bond that they couldn't ignore. It was a reminder that blood ties, no matter how complicated, ran deep. Had been absent from their lives, but the triplets were his flesh and blood, and that was something they couldn't change. It was a difficult pill to swallow, but Sarah realized that her love for the triplets didn't need to be threatened by Nathan's presence. She wasn't competing for their affection. She was their mother, and nothing could change that. The triplets had two families now, one they had known from birth, and one that was slowly being built with time. And so the journey continued. There were still many unanswered questions, still many hurdles to overcome. But Sarah and Andy had something stronger than any obstacle, a commitment to their children, a commitment to building a family no matter how unconventional it had become. Their love for the triplets was unwavering, and that was all that mattered. The strength of family, embracing the future no matter the past. The seasons changed, and so did the dynamics of the family. Sarah, Andy, and the triplets settled into a routine that balanced the complexities of their new reality with the love they had always shared. Nathan's role continued to evolve, and while Sarah had initially feared the worst, she began to see that he was genuinely trying. Slowly but surely, the wounds of the past were healing, but there was no denying that the scars would always remain. For the first time in a long while, Sarah found herself looking forward to what the future held. The tension that had once clouded every interaction with Nathan had started to dissipate, replaced with a cautious optimism. The children had warmed up to their biological father in their own way, responding to his presence in ways that Sarah hadn't expected. They didn't have a history with him, but they recognized him. This was the man who had given them life, and they were curious about the connection. But as Sarah and Andy had learned, their path wasn't going to be an easy one. While the triplets had grown attached to Nathan, they were still Sarah and Andy's children in every sense of the word. The bond they had built over the years couldn't be undone, no matter how hard Nathan tried to play catch-up. This was a love that had been forged in the fire of struggle, one that was stronger than any biological connection could be. One day, while Sarah was cleaning up after the children had gone to bed, she found herself lost in thought. She remembered the long, painful years of infertility, the feeling of hopelessness that had once overwhelmed her and Andy. But she also remembered the day they had received the call from the adoption agency. Day everything changed. The triplets were the light of her life, and in many ways, they had saved her. They had healed wounds she didn't even know existed, filling her heart with a love so deep, so pure, that it defied explanation. Their arrival had been a miracle in and of itself, and now, with Nathan back in the picture, she couldn't help but wonder if their family had been brought together for a reason. "Are you okay?" Andy's voice broke through her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, watching her with concern. Sarah smiled at him, but it was a bittersweet smile. "I've just been thinking about everything, the way things have changed. I don't know what to think about Nathan, about how all of this is playing out." Andy stepped into the room and pulled her into his arms. "You've been through a lot," he said softly. "I think we both have,
But you've done something incredible. We've done something incredible. These kids, our kids, they're going to grow up in a home filled with love. No matter what happens with Nathan, that's something no one can take away from us. Sarah let out a deep breath, leaning into him. I just want to protect them. I want to make sure they have the best possible life. And I want to make sure they know how loved they are. Whether Nathan's here or not, that's what matters to me. And that's what matters to me too, Andy replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. We'll figure this out together. We always have. As the days turned into weeks and then into months, the Justices continued to navigate the complexities of their conventional family. Nathan became a more consistent presence in the children's lives, but he was also learning to respect the boundaries that Sarah and Andy had set. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when doubt crept in, times when they questioned if they had made the right choice. But as they watched the triplets grow, as they saw the children bond with Nathan in their own way, they began to feel a sense of peace. The transition was never perfect. There were awkward moments, times when the children would ask questions Sarah wasn't sure how to answer. Why doesn't Nathan live with us, Mom? They would ask. Or when will we see Daddy again? It was in these moments that Sarah and Andy found themselves grappling with the complexities of what family truly meant. But they always came back to the same truth. Love was not defined by biology, but by action. It was in the sleepless nights spent comforting a sick child, and all the laughter shared over dinner, in the everyday sacrifices made for one another. They had been a family before Nathan arrived, and they would continue to be a family no matter what the future held. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch watching the sunset with Andy, she felt a sense of calm that had eluded her for so long. She had come a long way from the woman who had once been devastated by infertility. The pain of not being able to conceive had shaped her, but it had also led her to the greatest gift she could have ever asked for, the triplets. They were her children, and no matter what happened with Nathan, that would never change. I'm proud of us, Sarah said, her voice quiet but full of conviction. I'm proud of how far we've come. This family, we're stronger than I ever imagined. Andy took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. We've been through so much, but we've always come out on top, and we will continue together. Just then, the sound of the triplets' laughter echoed through the house as they ran out into the yard, their tiny feet pounding the grass. Sarah and Andy looked at each other, their hearts full of love. In that moment, they knew that everything they had endured, the struggles, the heartaches, the uncertainty, had all led them here. Their family, imperfect and unpredictable as it may be, was built on love. And that love, they both knew, would carry them through whatever came next. As the triplets tumbled into their arms, giggling and full of life, Sarah and Andy couldn't help but smile. They were a family, a real family, and nothing, not even the shadow of the past, could ever take that away.